Thank you, members. We will resume proceedings, and could I just advise for the record that the vote on Amendment 13 was misrecorded. In fact, it should have been yes 48, no 64, and in fact there were 4 abstentions, and the amendment therefore still is not agreed to. With that, we move on to consultation in connection with power to change release point. I call Amendment 21 in the name of Maggie Chapman, grouped with Amendment 22. I call on Maggie Chapman to move Amendment 21 and speak to both amendments in the group. Ms Chapman.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I rise to speak to the amendment in my name. In last week's Stage 1 debate, and indeed prior to that, we heard much about the lack of scrutiny or consultation that this section of the bill, or at least the regulations it enables, will have because of the emergency nature. My Amendment 21 seeks to provide some reassurance that before any regulations for the release of long-term prisoners can be laid, there will have to be consultation with key agencies and organisations, from local authorities and health boards to victim support organisations and risk management professionals. The list of specified organisations in the amendment is not exhaustive. It is open to ministers to engage with others too, but this specified is the minimum required. I accept that this isn't the full committee scrutiny that I know some of my colleagues in the chamber would like. However, if this bill passes this week, then we all have the responsibility to ensure that we also engage with these agencies and organisations, and with the Cabinet Secretary as regulations are drafted. It is not beyond our ability, I think, to try and collaborate as much as possible to ensure subordinate legislation is as robust as it can be before it is presented for decision. I thank the Cabinet Secretary and her office for engaging with me on this amendment in the last week, and I move the amendment in my name. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. I call on Sharon Dowie to speak to Amendment 22 and the other amendment in the group. Ms Dowie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We will be supporting Amendment 21 in the name of Maggie Chapman. My Amendment 22 would require that any change to the automatic release period through regulations be subject to further parliamentary scrutiny. Specifically, the amendment would require that a draft of the regulations be laid before the Scottish Parliament for a period of 120 days, of which no fewer than 60 days must be days which the Scottish Parliament is not dissolved or in recess, and that the views of the relevant committee are considered. This bill has already been rushed through, which has considerably impacted the Parliament's ability to scrutinise this bill. It would therefore be ill-advised to simply hand the Scottish Government the ability to change the automatic release point through regulations. This amendment will ensure that this Parliament has a say on any future changes to automatic early releases. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Dowie. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, the bill provides for a subordinate legislation-making power to enable the Scottish Ministers to make changes to the automatic release point for short-term and long-term prisoners. This will allow the changes made to the release point for short-term prisoners to be kept under active review, taking into account how the changes made by the bill have operated in practice, any new evidence available or new offences created or commenced. The bill also reinstates a power which existed prior to 2015, which will enable the release point for long-term prisoners, those serving 4 years or more, to be amended by subordinate legislation. I have listened to the concerns that have been raised by some members about this power, in particular in relation to long-term prisoners, and I know the next group seeks to remove it altogether. While this will not have an immediate impact for the reasons outlined at Stage 1, which are on the record, within the context of a high prison population and the need to ensure that a wide range of options is available to address this if need be, I consider it a matter of importance that this power is now restored. It was clear from a recent consultation that there are a number of issues to consider if making changes to the release process for long-term prisoners. That is why I welcome the opportunity to discuss how we may enhance the process around making regulations under these powers to ensure that full consideration is given to that in terms of what can be a complex issue, and I want to ensure that Parliament always has sufficient information to scrutinise proposals in detail. Therefore, I am supportive of Amendment 21 in the name of Maggie Chapman, which would require Scottish ministers to consult organisations providing support to victims, as well as key delivery partners who must be consulted before regulations can be made. We would always have intended to consult as appropriate ahead of laying regulations for parliamentary scrutiny, so it is helpful for the legislation to make that clear. Presiding Officer, I do not support Amendment 22 in the name of Sharon Dowie, which would require draft regulations to be laid for a period of 120 days, 60 of which must be sitting days, with views to be sought from relevant committee on the draft regulations and a statement made to Parliament which sets out the views of the committee and any changes that were made as a result of those views. After that, draft regulations would be laid under the affirmative procedure as usual. Committees already have an opportunity to scrutinise any regulations and take any evidence as they see fit. In addition, if Maggie Chapman's Amendment 21 is accepted, then we are also already building in time for guaranteed stakeholder engagement. I do not think the long drawn-out process this Amendment 22 would lead to would be proportionate or a valuable use of parliamentary time, particularly as it would be in every possible instance of this power being used, bearing in mind that this may include some quite minor changes, such as reflecting any new offence created or commenced. As I said in Group 5 in relation to Pauline McNeill, I would be willing to work with the member in developing a more proportionate amendment for Stage 3, which would ensure that Parliament is updated with key information regarding any proposed regulation under this power. And on that basis, I urge members to support Amendment 21 and reject Amendment 22.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call Maggie Chapman to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 21. Ms Chapman.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I don't have anything further to add. I press the amendment in my name.
Thank you, Ms Chapman. The question is that Amendment 21 be agreed to. Are we all agreed?
Yes.
Are we all agreed?
Yes.
The Parliament is agreed. I call Amendment 22 in the name of Sharon Dowie, already debated with Amendment 21. Sharon Dowie, to move or not move?
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'm happy to work with the Cabinet Secretary for Stage 3 and I won't move it.
Thank you, Ms Dowie. We will now move to the next subject heading, removal of new power to change release point. I call Amendment 23 in the name of Liam Kerr in a group on its own. And I call on Liam Kerr to move and to speak to Amendment 23. Mr Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The Amendment 23 has effect to remove Section 3 of the bill, the section which, if passed, would allow the government to change the release point for long-term prisoners under the regulations procedure, subordinate legislation. Presiding Officer, the government has justified this bill so far by saying it is about relieving pressure on a full prison system by releasing 400 prisoners in February and ongoing thereafter. The government justifies then the use of the emergency procedure to achieve that end by saying it must be put through now to give everyone, including the justice agencies, the chance to prepare for that release in February. But this Section 3 doesn't go towards either of those ends. It is an anomaly at best and, some might say, a devious insertion at worst, because it doesn't do anything to relieve the pressure. It doesn't do anything which would even marginally address the prison population at this stage. What this section does is simply reduce the scrutiny required were the government to wish to change the long-term prisoners' release point. It would change from the standard process of consultation, expert evidence, committee scrutiny, debate, considered amendments over several weeks, and final debates, all throughout supplemented with evidence from those with lived experience, from experts in the field, from those who can speak to consequences, to the regulations process, which lacks basically all of those stages. Remember, Presiding Officer, the last time this Parliament amended long-term prisoner sentencing in 2015, it took around a year from the laying of the bill to passing it. To put this change in this bill, let alone a bill which is running under an emergency procedure, is simply extraordinary, unnecessary, unwarranted and inexplicable. Changing the early release point for long-term prisoners, some of whom are in prison for the most egregious of offences, upon the stroke of a ministerial pen, and in doing so in a bill which has as its stated aim the immediate release of pressure running under the emergency procedure, is simply wrong. My amendment gives this Parliament the chance to prevent that wrong, and I hereby move Amendment 23 in my name.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. I now call in Martin Whitfield. Mr Whitfield.
I'm very grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer. And we return at this point to one of the challenges that there's been with this bill, that it is in essence two bills that are put together. We have the crisis in our prison population, which is acknowledged by everyone, not just across this chamber, but I think across Scotland, who understand the system, and the relation for a short-term releasing of that pressure through the release or the changing to the release criteria for short-term prisoners. We then have this second element with regard to long-term prisoners. And I indicated in the Stage 1 debate that this was probably a better separate bill that could have been properly investigated with a Stage 1 report, with a committee looking into it. And we have heard in the previous contribution what has happened in the past. Long-term prisoners are a different category towards short-term prisoners. And when we look at the policy documents that have been issued in relation to this, the arguments in relation to long-term prisoners are nowhere near as consistent, are nowhere near as solid as they are with regard to short-term prisoners. Reference is made to the consultation between July 2024 and August 2024, a shortened consultation which had a restricted number of responses to it, but those responses in the main indicated it is a very complex problem in relation to the release of long-term prisoners back into a community, back into society, back towards their families. And so, therefore, again, I look forward to hearing the Cabinet Secretary's view on this, and indeed to press as to why there is the urgency in relation to long-term prisoners when significant amount of the documentation that support this bill indicate that it is complex, it does need looking at, but without the urgency that some of the other elements of this bill do. And I will also, in a very short time, Deputy Presiding Officer, is again make reference that I've spoken to a lot this afternoon with regard to young people, and in relation to that group of young people that I haven't spoken about, which are the children and young people of prisoners who are released. We recognise as a society, on the back of strong academic research, that where a parent loses their right to liberty, this is an adverse childhood experience. And the recognition of that means that those young people need to be handled in a different, more sensitive way, and a large part of their reasoning and their results of actions that happen to them are driven by the fact that they're experiencing something that potentially very few of their friends' relations are doing so. The importance of ACEs has been raised in a number of debates over the past few years. It forms a large part of the discussion of the support that children need. But when we come to look at the effect of this in the impact assessment, the government's documentation is very thin on it, other than recognising it is an ACE. The reason for this is that the government are saying, in essence, an early release or a later period of release doesn't affect the fact that an ACE has occurred. But I suggest very strongly to the Cabinet Secretary there are a group of young people for whom it has huge, huge relevance. And that is where those young people, or indeed the family of those young people, have experienced violence and abuse that is not part of the sentencing or the crime for which the person has lost their liberty for a period of time. The individual will still be within the auspices of a potential early release into a family who fear that. And again, as I referenced in my earlier contributions on other amendments, very little has been done with respect to the government in relation to how this is going to be articulated. I accept and I welcome the Cabinet Secretary's assertions that have been made on other contributions that I've made about the ongoing reach out to those organisations that represent young people and to carry on doing that. And I would very much seek the same assurance in respect of this matter. We have an urgent bill in front of us. I genuinely am of the view that this part of it is not urgent. but that being so, an assurance from the Cabinet Secretary that with other legislation on the way, this is an opportunity to look at this very specific problem of what is a small group of people, but a group of people who at the minute are unprotected under the proposals that have been made. I'm grateful, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Whitfield. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, under Section 27(2)(b) 1993 Act, we already have the power to change the release point for short-term prisoners, but there is no nuance to that power, so it can't apply different release points to different categories of prisoner. And in an inadvertent consequence of the Prisoners Control and Release Act 2015, that has meant that the power that did exist for long-term prisoners is no longer usable. And although Section 27A in this bill is framed as a new power, it is in practical terms an adaptation of existing powers. Presiding Officer, as set out during Stage 1 and the previous group, I do consider it necessary to update the current powers which Scottish ministers have to amend the point of release using subordinate legislation, and that is within the context of the high prison population and the need to ensure that a wide range of options is available to address this, if appropriate, if circumstances require it. And a change cannot be made under this power without the scrutiny and approval of this Parliament. And as members will be aware, as I've indicated, these proposals would reinstate a power to change the release point for long-term prisoners on non-parole licence, which previously existed before the inadvertent change made by the 2015 Act. This will also allow for changes to be made to the release point for short-term prisoners so that that can be kept under review, taking into account how the changes made by the bill have operated in practice and any new evidence available or new offences created or commenced. And of course, it is worth noting that some long-term prisoners may also be released after serving 40% of their sentence following the recent changes made by the UK Government. And I only say that just to make a point that this is not novel for governments to have these powers. It would not be our intention to ever allow the release of long-term prisoners as early as that. And if I can just put that on the record now. But it is clear from a recent consultation that while there are a number of complex issues which require further consideration, there is support for principles of moving the release point for long-term prisoners. But we do need to consider the matter carefully. I concede that, but this is about ensuring that we have the tools available should this Parliament as a whole wish to use them. And the final point, Presiding Officer, is that I have listened to Parliament's concern and agree that additional scrutiny should be provided for should these provisions be used in future. And that is why I have supported Maggie Chapman's Amendment 21 and would be willing to work with members and develop an amendment at Stage 3, which would ensure that Parliament is updated with key information regarding any proposed regulations under this power. And I therefore urge members not to support this amendment in the name of Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I now call on Liam Kerr to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 23. Mr Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And once again, I thank Martin Whitfield and the Cabinet Secretary for their considered submissions. Martin Whitfield's opening point about the smashing of two bills together, I think is well made. I just don't understand the rush to depart from past practice, or why the Cabinet Secretary doesn't appear to recognise that long-term prisoners are different, or to make the case for doing it in this bill and doing it now. Martin Whitfield asked where the urgency was in relation to long-term prisoners, particularly as has been acknowledged, they are often more complex cases, and I think he was right to do so. The Cabinet Secretary went on in her remarks to consider it, to say that it was necessary to update the legislation. Maybe so. But she has to recognise that she's failed to explain why, in this bill under the emergency procedure, and by doing so we are not considering it, as the Cabinet Secretary rightly said, carefully. The fact is, Presiding Officer, that whilst I might not agree that the commuting of the short-term sentencing is right, I can see why the government might do it. However, the throwing in here of the provisions in Section 3 are not consistent with those aims. And I think people would be much more comfortable with this bill were Section 3 to be removed and given the proper and full scrutiny that it merits. Therefore, my amendment, Presiding Officer, gives Parliament the opportunity to do just that. And that is why I press Amendment 23 in my name. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Kerr. The question is that Amendment 23 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Lorna Slater.
Sorry, my vote appears not to have registered. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Ms Slater. In fact, your vote had already been recorded as no. Sorry. For the point of order, Ms Slater.
Sorry, Presiding Officer. Yeah, there may be some problem with the app because it is telling me that I haven't voted, but I'll check with...
Thank you, Ms Slater. I understand your vote has in fact been recorded as no. The result of the vote on amendment number 23 in the name of Liam Kerr is yes 53, no 65. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. We now move on to the next subject matter, requirement to reinstate 50% release point if prison capacity improves. I call Amendment 24 in the name of Jamie Green in a group on its own, and I call on Jamie Green to move and speak to Amendment 24. Mr Green.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I should say I will move the amendment. Members will remember during the Stage 1 debate, I, as vigorously as I could, made the point what exactly was the emergency that we were trying to tackle with this bill. And when should this Parliament use emergency legislation? In my view, emergency legislation should be used to provide short-term solutions to short-term problems. Now, the government has made the case that the short-term problem is that our prisons are full and they must take action. Now, you can take a view on what has been proposed. The action they propose is that we reduce sentence lengths. The Cabinet Secretary has made clear that's one of a number of measures that she may take or propose that Parliament takes. I am intrigued by that. I look forward to hearing more about what those measures may be as we debate further. But as I've said in the Stage 1 and throughout this debate this afternoon, this isn't a new problem. We've known for years that this was coming down the line. I've sat in the Justice Committee 2.5, 3 years ago. We heard evidence that the prisons were filling up fast and that action needed to be taken. So why on earth we're pushing this bill through in one day is beyond me. That point's been well made. But we are where we are with the bill. Well, in a second. We are where we are. But the point I want to make with this amendment is that nothing in this bill is temporary. Nothing is an emergency measure to deal with an emergency situation. The changes being proposed today are permanent ones. They will become permanent fixtures of our justice system. And for that reason, I have drafted an amendment to deal with that, which I'll come on to in a second. I'm happy to give way to the member.
Edward Mountain.
And I thank the member for giving way. I mean, we've known it's been coming down the line for a significantly long period of time. In fact, in 2016, it was promised that Inverness would get a new Highland prison.
Mr Mountain, could I ask you please to address your comments to the front, because the audiology is
Sorry.
different.
We've known for a while this has been coming down the line, because in 2016 it was agreed to increase the capacity of Highland prison by creating a new one, still not built, and this has contributed to the problem. So surely this should be taken into account when we're considering amendments.
Jamie Green.
Yeah, and the comments I made last week were I had a whole list of things that were contributing to the fact that our prisons are full, and capacity is the primary one. They're not full because there are too many people in prison. They're full because there are too few spaces for the people that are in prison. There is a capacity issue. That capacity issue has been known for a very long time, and the actions that the government said they would take to improve capacity simply have not been taken. Perfect example, Mr Mountain has stated on the record. It's not the only one. In my region, HMP Greenock is a perfect example of a prison that the Inspectorate found to be wanting in terms of conditions. So we are where we are with this, and it's the last amendment. So when all else fails, add a sunset clause. That seems to be the way that we deal with legislation in here. We haven't been able to persuade the Cabinet Secretary of anything so far this afternoon, but I do hope she might be minded to be persuaded by this one. Amendment 24 requires the government to return to automatic early release rules that are the status quo if and when the Scottish prison population reaches 90% or below of its target operating capacity. Now, I do hope that additional capacity is coming down the line. That may solve that problem. But essentially, if this bill achieves its intended purpose, which is to reduce the prison population, which seems to be its purpose, then this bill should either be revoked or Parliament should have the ability to revert to the status quo. If it's a temporary measure, Cabinet Secretary, let's make it a temporary measure. But there's nothing in the bill that lets us do that. This amendment will. Now, I've added some caveats, primarily to make, I hope, the amendment more palatable and offering some comfort to the Cabinet Secretary, to the Government, but also to other members, that they will have some say in this in the way that we haven't had so far. The caveats are threefold. One, the prison population would have to remain at 90% of its target operating capacity or below for at least 90 days or 3 months. Now, that is a sensible addition to the proposal, because I appreciate that the prison population fluctuates due to, for example, those being held on remand varies on a daily, weekly basis. So there would need to be some consistency to this. I want to see a pattern that the prison numbers are coming down and that the bill is meeting its objective thereof. That's the first caveat. The second is that ministers will have an additional power to vary that period. So, for example, if they believe that that trend needs to be longer, then they may come forth to Parliament and present a case for that. And I think that's a helpful addition to give ministers a little bit more flexibility. But the third, and this is the more important one, is that Parliament should have a view. This will be subject to the affirmative procedure. And if Parliament actually decides that the 40% early release figure needs to remain, then it can vote to do so. That is the point of giving Parliament a say in all of this. Because I cannot support, in good conscience, emergency measures which have no end date in sight. They don't have that at the moment. There's still a possibility we can do that. We can add either a sunset clause at stage 3. We can either add this option for Parliament to revert. If the bill meets its objective, and we all hope it does, then let's insert something in the bill that allows us to go back to a fair principle of 50% automatic early release, whatever your views on that. Bear in mind, this is a government that once promised to end automatic early release in its entirety. This should not be unpalatable to it. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you, Mr Green. I call Pauline McNeill. Ms McNeill.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Jamie Green for putting this amendment down and allowing discussion on what I think is a really important aspect of the bill, because, of course, current policy on release is that prisoners would be released at 50%, and if passed tonight, it will be moved back to 40% with no end in sight, as Jamie Green says. Now, I've got big concerns about the bill. The biggest one is the one that Liam Kerr spoke to earlier on in relation to Section 3, long-term prisoners. But probably my second most concerning aspect of the bill is that there is no prospect, if we pass it tonight, that we'll ever go back to the position of early release at 40%. Now, I close with this. I don't know if the government are open-minded, because I would have thought you might be, the government might be, because the reason, the rationale for the policy is to relax the numbers within our prisons in order, as they say, to allow prison officers to manage the prison estate in a way that they think is safe. And given that, you would think that at some point in the future then, there would be some opportunity to go back to what is a substantive policy that we've had for some time in Scotland, that you should serve at least 50% of your sentence if you are serving a sentence under 4 years. But the problem with the lack of scrutiny is we're all going to be scratching our heads to think about, well, what might actually be the point of which we could submit an amendment at stage 3 that might actually be palatable to the government. And right now I have no idea about that. I think Jamie Green's suggestion is definitely worth considering, which is 90%. I certainly think there should be a sunset clause on this. We will be thinking about at what time period would be sensible. We are going to vote against the bill, but if the bill is going to survive, we'd at least like to try and amend it so that there is some end in sight in relation to this policy.
Thank you, Ms McNeill. And I call in the Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. In this last grouping of Stage 2, I think it is important that I put on record to balance the somewhat rewriting of history, because this is something that I have looked at tremendously closely. And the facts of the matter are that due to the reforms that this government led, often opposed by opposition members, that the prison population actually did decrease between 2010-11 up to 2018. It did, of course, start to increase again in 2019 for some of the reasons that we are contending with today. COVID came along, we've seen a dip in the prison population, and then with the post-COVID recovery, we've seen a prison population that got to very high levels over 23 to 24, and up until March this year, it was high, but it had stabilised at a high level. I'm not suggesting that that in itself is not problematic. And then there was a spike between March and May that led to bringing forward early emergency release regulations. But the issue is now is what are we going to do now? I hear lots of discussions about the need for long-term plans. I've laid out the plans that we have implemented in the past and what we intend to pursue for the future. And I'm not going to rehearse the evidence sessions that I have participated in at committee, or indeed the 4 or 5 parliamentary statements that I have made. But in terms of course,
Liam Kerr.
Very grateful, and I'm listening to the point. In that case, can the Cabinet Secretary remind me what are the plans for to deal with the 25% of the population on remand?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the plans to deal with the 25% on remand are with the cooperation of the UK Government to see the new bail test implemented, which will be implemented at the start of 2025. Again, that was a measure that was opposed by the 2 main opposition parties in this chamber. It's also to continue our investment in alternatives to remand, to build on the progress that we've made with measures measures such as electronic monitoring, which of course is the highest that it has ever been. And we will of course bring forward other measures, as I've outlined at the start of the year, around whether it's the use of home detention, curfew, or indeed other measures for us to bolster community justice services in terms of those alternatives, those robust alternatives to short-term sentences, which are often more effective. But in terms of Amendment 24, in the name of Mr Green, this would reverse the change made to short-term release point if the prison population is at or is under 90% of the target operating capacity of the prison estate as a whole for a period of 90 days. And any amendment linked to population numbers fails to recognise the complex and challenging nature of the prison population and the dynamic nature of the operating capacity for the Scottish Prison Service at any one time. Predicting flows into prison is acknowledged to be challenging, and large fluctuations can and are seen on a daily basis. There are times over the past few months I have seen the prison population overnight increase by 75. Yes.
Pauline McNeill.
So I understand the point that's been made is that prison populations on a daily basis are complex, so I understand that. But as the Cabinet Secretary, given this is a measure to deal with the crisis now, ideally, presumably this is not where you'd like to be. You would like prisoners to serve their 50% sentence. But what you're asking the Parliament to do is make it permanent. Are you even open-minded at all to a sunset clause that would say that you would revisit it in 3 years or 5 years? Because if you don't, what it means is, for all time, you're asking the Parliament to change the policy of early release from 50% to 40% for a crisis that exists now and may not exist in 3 years' time.
Always through the Chair. Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, once I had put in the record my issues with Mr Green's amendment, I was very much intending to come to the point that Ms McNeill made, and actually, to be fair, that Mr Green also made as well. But just to reiterate the point that predicting flows into prison is acknowledged to be challenging. We do see large fluctuations, including amongst specific groups who need to be accommodated separately. It could be that the population levels trigger the need to amend the release point, but by the time that this change is applied, the estate would once again be beyond the target operating capacity. And in addition to causing a high degree of operational uncertainty, this would have a negative impact on both prisoners and victims. Not knowing when a change could be triggered would introduce uncertainty into release planning and make it harder to ensure victims can be notified in advance should they have requested such information. As I've repeatedly said, Presiding Officer, this is not just about high population numbers, it's about the increasingly complex prisoner population and about the capacity of the prison service to deliver a safe and rehabilitative regime. And if I can make 2 points in response to Ms McNeill's earlier intervention. One of the arguments for having good, well-rounded subordinate legislation powers is to enable that review in response to changing circumstances or evidence. People always assume that ministers want to use powers to reduce release points, where actually, in theory, these points could, of course, be increased. But what I am open to, Presiding Officer, in good faith, and I would be willing to discuss this with both Ms McNeill and Mr Green, is that it would be possible, if we could find some common ground, to commit to a statutory review of the operation of the Act. Thank you.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. And I call on Jamie Green to wind up and to press or withdraw Amendment 24. Mr Green.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank both the members for their contributions to my comments on this amendment. Pauline McNeill, I think, raises some good points. She asked the fundamental question posed to us and the Cabinet Secretary is it realistic that we will ever revert back to 50% early release? I mean, that is the question we're being asked. I think the answer to that, and I think we all know the answer to that, is no, it won't. Now, the Cabinet Secretary says that she will have the power to alter early release limits. In fact, they may change in the opposite direction. People must serve 70 or 80% of their sentence. Who knows? If you believe that, you believe anything. There's no way on earth that the government is going to revert back to 50%. And there's no ability for us as a parliament to revert it back to 50%. That's the problem. We need the ability as a parliament to decide that, not ministers. There is a wider debate about what is the optimum value or length of a sentence. Now, I'd like to see some academic work on that. I'm open-minded to having the debate. I'm not necessarily even opposed to changing the length of sentences before people are early released. I think we've come to the point now where to revert back to 100% of sentence served is pie in the sky. However, if we are to have that debate about what is the level at which someone should be released early on good behaviour, for example, then I would like to know what is the optimum sentence length for example, things like proper and due rehabilitation, which we haven't even had a proper debate about. And Liam Kerr made a really interesting point earlier in today's debate, and that's that the last time this Parliament sat and actually had a proper and meaningful debate about altering the lengths of sentences, that process took nearly a year to do. And that's probably a bit too long, but it's certainly just and gave justice to the subject matter that Parliament then was asked to make a judgment on. You need time to do that. You need to take evidence. You need to look at historic patterns. You need to look back and see what happened the last time powers like this were used in the past and what happened as a result of that. And using all that empirical evidence, perhaps the Parliament can come to a sensible view. Yes, they can disagree, but rushing it through in the way that we are today, we're not even able to have that meaningful debate, nor are we able... I mean, my office are on the phone at the moment speaking to victims' organisations who are watching the session online and in a blind panic about what this means for victims, thinking about amendments that they could submit. And I say to them, it's too late. Stage 2 is done and dusted in about 3 minutes. But we might be able to cobble something together for Stage 3. That's no way to make law like this. What I would say to the Cabinet Secretary, particularly on this amendment, is she talked a lot about the 90% of capacity and the 90-day average issue, but didn't really offer a solution to it. Now, all I would say to the Cabinet Secretary is if 90% isn't an optimum figure, then suggest a different one. Tell me what the government would like to see. 80%, 70%. I'm very open to coming back with an amended version of this that is palatable to the government, but there must be a compromise here somewhere. If 90 days isn't the optimum average, to wait and see, because she's right, fluctuations do happen on the prison estate. They go up and down on a daily basis overnight. But that's why I put in a 3-month average, a 3-month consistent reduction in operating capacity. That surely is long enough to know that there's a trend occurring and therefore that changes could be made. At the end of the day, it's all about fairness. People watching this will want to see us inject some fairness into this for the sake of victims. And actually, the bigger point is that Liam Kerr made in his contribution was that if we reduced the remand population properly, quickly and efficiently, there would be no need for this bill at all, I would assume. So why don't we do that, Cabinet Secretary? I move the amendment.
Thank you, Mr Green. The question is that Amendment 24 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Lorna Slater.
Sorry, Presiding Officer, my app has crashed out. I would have voted no.
Thank you, Ms Slater. Your vote will be recorded. Point of order, Douglas Lumsden.
Point of order, Presiding Officer. My app seemed to crash. I wanted to vote yes.
Thank you, Mr Lumsden. I understand your vote, in fact, had already been recorded. Thank you. The result of the vote on amendment number 24 in the name of Jamie Green is yes 54, no 66. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 25 in the name of Liam Kerr, already debated with amendment 12. Liam Kerr, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. The question is that section 4 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed. I call amendment 26 in the name of Sharon Dowie, already debated with amendment 10. Sharon Dowie, to move or not move?
Moved.
The question is that amendment 26 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? No. Parliament is not agreed. There will be a division and members should cast their vote now. The vote is now closed. Point of order, Lorna Slater.
My app is still not connecting. I would have voted no. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms Slater. Your vote will be recorded. The result of the vote on amendment number 26 in the name of Sharon Dowie is yes 50, no 70. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. I call amendment 27 in the name of Liam Kerr, already debated with amendment 12. Liam Kerr, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Not moved. The question is that the schedule be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Thank you. We are agreed. I call amendment 28 in the name of Liam Kerr, already debated with amendment 12. Liam Kerr, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. Not moved. The question is that section 5 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. I call amendment 29 in the name of Liam Kerr, already debated with amendment 12. Liam Kerr, to move or not move?
Not moved.
The question is that section 6 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is agreed. I call amendment 30 in the name of Liam Kerr, already debated with amendment 12. Liam Kerr, to move or not move?
Not moved.
Thank you. That's not moved. And the question is that section 7 be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is agreed. And I put the question that the long title be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is therefore agreed. That ends stage 2 consideration of the bill. Point of order, Liam Kerr.
Simply, Presiding Officer, you quite rightly asked us if we agreed all the sections from section 4, but we weren't, as a Parliament, asked to agree sections 1 to 3 earlier on. I wonder if the standing orders require us to do that.
Thank you, Mr Kerr, for your point of order. In fact, my understanding is that the relevant sections that the member refers to were the subject of amendments that the member pressed, and therefore the amendments were defeated. And that is my understanding of the position. And sorry, if Mr Kerr's got a further point, he would need to stand up and not do that from a sedentary position.
Very grateful, Presiding Officer. It's just purely that, as I understand it, the Presiding Officer puts the question, do we agree Section 1, for example, and I don't think Parliament was given that question.
I thank Mr Kerr for his further point of order, but in fact where the amendments the question posed in the amendment is to leave out the section. There is no requirement thereafter, if the amendment falls, to put the same question again. So I hope that that's clear. So we have now reached the end of the Stage 2 consideration of the Prisoners Early Release Scotland Bill. I would now ask on behalf of the Presiding Officer herself that the Minister for Parliamentary Business, Jamie Hepburn, and the business managers join me and the Presiding Officer and the other Deputy Presiding Officer in Committee Room 5 to discuss timings and the deadline for lodging amendments to Stage 3. I will suspend proceedings for around 10 minutes in order to allow that discussion to take place, and I would ask members to stay in the chamber for the duration of that short suspension, and the meeting will be reconvened immediately after that discussion takes place so that members can be advised of the timescales involved. Thank you, and I suspend for 10 minutes or so.